Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Through Ages. Tonight we're looking at Marcus Tullius Cicero, often remembered as a master of Latin eloquence, but better understood as a statesman attempting to maintain a legalistic framework in an era of increasing military dominance. To understand Cicero, we have to start not in the marble halls of the Senate, but in the hills of Arpinum, a small town about 60 miles southeast of Rome. Cicero was born here in 106 BC into a family that belonged to the equestrian order. At first glance, being an equestrian sounds like a simple military designation, but by this period in Roman history, it represented a specific economic class. These were the businessmen, the tax collectors, and the landowners who had wealth but lacked the hereditary political pedigree of the patrician elite. Growing up in a provincial town like Arpinum meant that Cicero was, in many ways, an outsider to the closed circles of Roman power. This distance is important because it shaped his perspective on the Roman state. For a provincial outsider, the rule of law wasn't just an abstract ideal. It was the only ladder available for someone who didn't have a famous last name or a private army to fall back on. One of the reasons this provincial background mattered was the specific cultural tension of the time. Rome was undergoing a massive expansion, but its social structures were still deeply rooted in old city-state traditions. Cicero's father, a man of quiet scholarly interests, recognized that the traditional path to power, military glory, was becoming increasingly volatile. He chose instead to invest heavily in his son's education, sending Marcus and his brother Quintus to Rome to study under the best teachers of the day. This decision reflects a broader systemic shift in Roman society. As the empire grew, the need for skilled administrators and legal experts began to rival the need for generals. Cicero's education was not merely a luxury, it was a strategic preparation for a new kind of political career based on intellectual merit rather than ancestral battlefield success. The problem with this situation was that Rome in the 90s BC was a place of extreme political instability. As Cicero was beginning his studies, the city was rocked by the Social War, a brutal conflict between Rome and its Italian allies who were demanding citizenship. It is often misunderstood as a simple ethnic conflict, but it was actually a crisis of political integration. The system was struggling to determine who belonged to the Roman state and who was merely a subject. Cicero actually served briefly in the military during this time under Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, the father of the future Pompey the Great. However, this short stint in the army only served to convince him that his talents lay elsewhere. He watched as the traditional legal processes were pushed aside by the sheer force of military commands, and this early exposure to civil strife likely fueled his lifelong desire to return the state to a civilian-led order. By this point, Cicero had begun to immerse himself in the study of law under Quintus Mucius Scaevola, the most distinguished legal mind of the era. This apprenticeship was not like a modern law school, it was a form of total immersion. Cicero would follow Scaevola to the forum every day, listening to his legal opinions and watching how he navigated the complex web of Roman statutes and precedents. What matters here is the realization that Roman law was not a fixed code, but a living, breathing tradition maintained through constant public debate. This environment taught Cicero that a well-crafted argument was more than just words. It was a way to define reality for the jury and the public. He learned that in a society without a professional police force or a centralized bureaucracy, the courts were the primary mechanism for maintaining social order. One of the reasons Cicero's early career is so fascinating is his decision to study philosophy alongside law. While many of his peers viewed philosophy as a Greek distraction, Cicero saw it as a necessary foundation for ethical governance. He studied with the head of the Platonic Academy, Philo of Larissa, who had fled to Rome to escape the Mithridatic Wars. This exposure to academic skepticism, a school of thought that emphasized questioning assumptions and looking for the most probable truth, gave Cicero a mental flexibility that would later define his political style. He wasn't interested in rigid dogmas. He was interested in what worked for the preservation of the state. This intellectual relaxation allowed him to approach legal problems with a wider perspective than a traditional Roman aristocrat who was bound by the narrow interests of his clan. The first major test of Cicero's skills came in 80 BC, during the dictatorship of Sulla. This was a dangerous time to be a lawyer. Sulla had introduced proscriptions, where his political enemies were declared outlaws and their property was seized. Cicero took on the defense of a man named Sextus Roscius, who was accused of parricide, the murder of his own father. At first glance, this looks like a standard criminal case, but the underlying reality was much more political. Roscius's father's estate had been seized by one of Sulla's powerful favorites, Chrysogonus, who had then framed the son to ensure he couldn't reclaim the property. Most established lawyers refused to touch the case, fearing Sulla's wrath. Cicero, however, saw an opportunity. He carefully structured his defense to praise Sulla personally while ruthlessly attacking the corruption of Sulla's subordinates. This distinction allowed him to win the case and save his client without directly challenging the dictator's authority. This victory established Cicero as a rising star, but the stress of the trial and his intense work habits began to take a toll on his health. He was described as being thin and physically fragile, with a voice that he often strained by shouting in the forum. One of the reasons he decided to leave Rome for 2 years to travel through Greece and Asia Minor was purely practical. He needed to learn how to speak without destroying his body. In Rhodes, he studied with the famous orator Molo, who taught him how to control his breathing and modulate his tone. This period of continuing education is a reminder that Cicero viewed his oratorical ability as a professional craft that required constant refinement. He wasn't just a naturally gifted speaker. He was a trained athlete of the voice, preparing himself for the long-term physical demands of Roman politics. Upon his return to Rome in 77 BC, Cicero was a changed man. He was physically stronger, his voice was more resonant, and he had a newfound confidence in his ability to navigate the highest levels of society. He married Terentia, a woman from a wealthy and influential family, which provided him with the financial stability and social connections he needed to launch his political career in earnest. In the Roman system, marriage was often a tactical alliance, and Terentia's strong personality and management of the family estates allowed Cicero to focus entirely on his public duties. He was elected as a quaestor, the first step on the cursus honorum, and was assigned to serve in western Sicily. This role involved managing the grain supply and overseeing financial accounts, a task that was far from glamorous but essential for the survival of the city of Rome. The way Cicero handled his time in Sicily is a perfect example of his systemic approach to politics. Most Roman officials saw a provincial assignment as a chance to extract as much wealth as possible from the locals. Cicero, however, realized that by acting with integrity and fairness, he could build a long-term network of loyal clients who would support him later in his career. He ensured that the grain was shipped to Rome on time, but he also protected the Sicilian farmers from the predatory practices of Roman tax collectors. When he left the island, the Sicilians were so grateful that they promised to support him whenever he needed them. This wasn't just kindness, it was a brilliant piece of political logistics. He was trading short-term financial gain for long-term political capital, a move that would pay off a few years later during the trial of Verres. When Cicero returned to Rome from Sicily, he expected to be greeted as a hero. However, he quickly realized that the fast-paced world of the capital had already moved on. There is a famous story that he met a friend in Puteoli who asked him which province he had been in, completely unaware that Cicero had even been away. This moment of humility taught Cicero a valuable lesson. If he wanted to maintain his influence, he had to be constantly visible in the heart of the city. He made it a point to live near the Forum, to be available to his clients at all hours of the morning, and to never let the public forget his voice. In a world without mass media, a politician's power was directly proportional to his physical presence in the public square. This brings us to the year 70 BC, a pivotal moment for both Cicero and the Republic. The consulships of Pompey and Crassus had begun to dismantle the restrictive laws that Sulla had put in place, restoring power to the tribunes and the courts. It was in this atmosphere of reform that the Sicilians came to Cicero, asking him to prosecute their former governor, Gaius Verres. Verres was the embodiment of everything that was wrong with Roman provincial administration. He had spent 3 years plundering Sicily, stealing art from temples, executing citizens without trial, and pocketing public funds. Because Verres was a member of the high aristocracy and had hired the most famous lawyer in Rome, Hortensius, he felt untouchable. He famously bragged that his first year's plunder was for himself, the second for his lawyers, and the third for his future jurors. The trial of Verres was Cicero's make-or-break moment. If he won, he would become the top orator in Rome and prove that the courts could still hold the powerful accountable. If he lost, he would likely remain a secondary figure, overshadowed by the established families. Cicero approached the case with a level of logistical precision that was unheard of. He requested only 110 days to gather evidence, and then completed the task in just 50, traveling across Sicily himself to document the crimes. He realized that the defense was planning to delay the trial until the following year, when a more sympathetic judge would be in power. To counter this, Cicero threw out the traditional long opening speech and instead went straight to the evidence and witness testimony. The weight of the facts was so overwhelming that Verres fled into exile before the first phase of the trial was even over. What matters here is how this victory redefined Cicero's role in the Roman system. He had successfully used the tools of the Republic to take down a corrupt member of the elite, but he had done so without starting a riot or leading an army. He had proven that the law could still function as a check on power, provided someone was willing to do the hard work of gathering the facts. For Cicero, the Verres trial wasn't just a personal win, it was a proof of concept for his political philosophy. He believed that the best men of Rome, the optimates, had a duty to govern through the law, and that when they failed to do so, they threatened the stability of the entire state. This victory propelled him into the higher offices of the cursus honorum, setting the stage for his eventual consulship and the much larger crises that were looming on the horizon of the Roman world. One of the reasons this period feels so grounded is the absence of the dramatic military battles that usually dominate Roman history. Cicero's battles were fought in the shade of the porticos and on the stone steps of the basilicas. He was navigating a system of incentives where the desire for prestige had to be balanced against the need for public order. By the end of this first part of his career, Cicero had established himself as the ultimate professional in a world of amateurs. He had no army, no noble ancestors, and no immense inherited wealth, yet he had become one of the most powerful men in Rome simply by understanding how the system worked and how to explain it to others. He was now ready to enter the inner circle of Roman power, unaware that the system he had mastered was about to face a series of shocks that no amount of eloquence could fully resolve. The move from the courts of the Forum to the executive offices of the Roman state required a shift in Cicero's political strategy. While his legal victories had made him a household name, they had also made him several powerful enemies within the traditional aristocracy. To reach the consulship, the ultimate goal for any Roman politician, he had to navigate a system that was increasingly divided between two major ideological camps: the optimates, who favored the traditional authority of the Senate, and the populares, who sought to bypass the Senate by appealing directly to the citizen assemblies. Cicero, as a new man with no ancestral ties to either group, found himself in a unique position. He realized that his best chance for success lay in positioning himself as a defender of the status quo, a man who could protect the interests of the wealthy property owners while still maintaining the respect of the common people through his commitment to the law. One of the reasons this strategy worked was the specific nature of Roman voting. The elections were not a simple count of individual heads. They were organized into centuries and tribes, with the wealthier classes having a disproportionate amount of influence. To win the consulship in 64 BC, Cicero had to build a coalition that spanned the entire social spectrum. His younger brother, Quintus, famously wrote a handbook for him called the Commentarium Petitionis, which provides a fascinating look into the cold logic of Roman campaigning. Quintus advised his brother to be all things to all men, to make promises even if he couldn't keep them, and to constantly remind the voters of the scandals and failures of his opponents. This wasn't seen as dishonest. It was viewed as a necessary part of building the concord of the orders that Cicero believed was the only way to save the Republic. What matters here is the identity of Cicero's main opponent in that election, Lucius Sergius Catilina, or Catiline. Catiline was everything Cicero was not. He was a patrician from an old, albeit faded, noble family, and he had a reputation for violence and recklessness. Catiline's platform was based on the radical idea of tabulae nova, or the total cancellation of debts. In a city where many aristocrats were heavily in debt due to their lavish lifestyles and many poor citizens were struggling to survive, this was a powerful and dangerous message. For the Roman elite, Catiline represented a systemic threat to the very idea of private property. This fear is what eventually drove the old money senators to support Cicero, the provincial outsider, over one of their own. They saw Cicero as the lesser of two evils, a man who would at least respect the rules of the game. By the time Cicero took office as consul on January 1st, 63 BC, the atmosphere in Rome was thick with tension. The city was full of veterans from Sulla's wars who had been given land, but had failed as farmers, and were now looking for a new leader to lead them back to glory. At first glance, the consulship might seem like a position of absolute power, but it was actually a role defined by constraints. Cicero had to share his authority with a co-consul, Gaius Antonius Hybrida, who was rumored to be sympathetic to Catiline's cause. To neutralize this threat, Cicero made a pragmatic deal. He gave Antonius the lucrative governorship of Macedonia for the following year in exchange for his political cooperation. This move allowed Cicero to effectively run the state single-handedly, but it also highlighted the way the Republic's offices were often treated as commodities to be traded. The problem with this situation was that Catiline did not go away after losing the election. Instead, he began to organize a clandestine movement of disgruntled nobles, bankrupt veterans, and desperate urban poor. Their plan was to launch a simultaneous uprising in Rome and the countryside, assassinate the consuls, and seize control of the government. Cicero's primary challenge was that he had plenty of intelligence about the plot, thanks to a network of informants, including a woman named Fulvia, who was the mistress of one of the conspirators, but he lacked the hard, physical evidence that would stand up in a court of law. In a system that valued the rights of citizens, he couldn't simply arrest a nobleman like Catiline on hearsay. He had to maneuver Catiline into a position where his guilt was undeniable to the entire Senate. One of the reasons Cicero's handling of the crisis was so carefully staged was his use of the senatus consultum ultimum, or the final decree of the Senate. This was a controversial measure that essentially declared a state of emergency and urged the consuls to take whatever actions were necessary to protect the Republic. Cicero used his oratorical skill to create a sense of imminent danger, delivering a series of 4 speeches known as the Catilinarians. In the first speech, delivered with Catiline actually present in the Senate House, Cicero famously began with the words, "How long, Catiline, will you abuse our patience?" By publicly exposing the details of the plot, Cicero forced Catiline to flee the city and join his small army in Etruria. This was a calculated move. Once Catiline was with an armed force in the field, he could be declared a public enemy, simplifying the legal situation. However, the conspirators who remained in Rome presented a much more difficult problem. They were captured after they foolishly tried to recruit the Allobroges, a Gallic tribe who were in Rome to petition the Senate. The Gauls, realizing they had more to gain from the established government, handed the conspirators' letters over to Cicero. With this physical evidence in hand, Cicero brought the captured men before the Senate for a marathon debate on December 5, 63 BC. This debate is one of the most famous moments in Roman history because it featured a clash between 2 rising stars, Julius Caesar and Cato the Younger. Caesar argued for life imprisonment, warning that executing citizens without a trial was a dangerous precedent. Cato, however, argued that in a time of war, the conspirators should be treated as enemy combatants. Cicero, as the presiding consul, chose to follow Cato's harder line. He ordered the 5 conspirators to be taken to the Tullianum, a grim underground prison where they were strangled to death. When the deed was done, Cicero walked out to the waiting crowd in the forum and announced their deaths with a single word: "Vixerunt, they have lived." At that moment, he was at the absolute peak of his power. He was hailed as the father of his country and felt that he had successfully defended the Republic through a combination of intelligence, law, and decisive action. But the quiet conclusion of this triumph was the beginning of his eventual downfall. By bypassing the right of appeal, Cicero had provided his future enemies with the very weapon they would use to destroy him. One of the reasons the Catiline crisis is so important for understanding the late Republic is what it reveals about the breakdown of the Roman consensus. The conspiracy was not just a criminal plot. It was a symptom of a society where the traditional paths to success were no longer working for a large portion of the elite. When men of noble birth feel that the only way to maintain their status is to burn the system down, the system is already in a state of terminal decline. Cicero's Concord of the Orders was a beautiful theory, but it couldn't address the underlying economic and social pressures that were driving men like Catiline to desperation. He had treated the symptoms of the disease with great skill, but the cause remained untouched. By this point, the political focus of Rome was starting to shift toward a man who had been relatively quiet during the Catiline affair, Pompey the Great. Pompey was returning from the east after a series of spectacular military victories that had doubled the size of the Roman Empire's revenue. Every politician in Rome, including Cicero, was wondering how Pompey would use his power when he landed in Italy. Would he follow the example of Sulla and march on the city to seize control? Or would he disband his army and return to civilian life? Cicero wrote a long, somewhat boastful letter to Pompey, detailing his own success in saving the city and suggesting that they form a partnership, Cicero as the wise advisor and Pompey as the military arm. Pompey's response was cold and brief. He was not interested in sharing the spotlight with a civilian who talked too much. The problem with Cicero's personality was his inability to stop reminding everyone of his achievements. He mentioned his consulship and the defeat of Catiline in almost every speech he gave, which gradually began to alienate his allies and annoy the public. This wasn't just vanity, it was a defensive mechanism. As a new man, Cicero felt he had to constantly re-justify his place at the top of the Roman hierarchy. He lacked the effortless confidence of the high aristocracy, who felt they belonged in power by right of birth. This insecurity made him vulnerable to the shifting winds of Roman politics. While he was busy writing a poem about his own consulship, new alliances were being formed in the shadows that would soon render his traditionalist approach obsolete. In 60 BC, the landscape changed forever with the formation of the first triumvirate. Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus realized that by pooling their resources, Caesar's popularity, Pompey's military prestige, and Crassus's immense wealth, they could bypass the Senate and run the state themselves. They invited Cicero to join them, recognizing that his legal expertise and public standing would give their alliance a veneer of legitimacy. Cicero, however, refused. He saw the triumvirate for exactly what it was, a private agreement that undermined the public institutions he spent his life defending. This was perhaps the most principled moment of his life, but it was also a tactical disaster. By refusing to join the three most powerful men in Rome, he left himself completely unprotected. One of the reasons this period was so dangerous for Cicero was the rise of a new type of populist politician, exemplified by Publius Clodius Pulcher. Clodius was a nobleman who had himself adopted into a plebeian family specifically so he could run for the office of tribune of the plebs. He was a master of street politics and gang violence, and he had a personal grudge against Cicero. Clodius realized that he could use the execution of the Catilinarian conspirators as a legal wedge to remove Cicero from the city. He proposed a law that would banish any magistrate who had put a Roman citizen to death without a formal trial. This law was clearly targeted at Cicero, and despite his attempts to rally the Senate and the equestrian order to his side, the triumvirate remained silent. They were happy to see their most eloquent critic neutralized. In early 58 BC, the situation became untenable. Clodius's gangs were roaming the streets, and Cicero's supporters were being intimidated into silence. Realizing that staying in Rome would lead to a violent confrontation or his own death. Cicero chose to go into voluntary exile. He left the city in the middle of the night, crossing the sea to Greece. As soon as he was gone, Clodius passed a decree officially banishing him and then led a mob to burn down Cicero's house on the Palatine Hill. Clodius even went so far as to build a temple to Liberty on the site of the house, a final, mocking insult to the man who claimed to be the Republic's greatest defender. Cicero's rise had been meteoric, but his fall was just as swift, proving that, in the late Republic, the law was only as strong as the people willing to enforce it. The quiet observation that ends this part of his life is the stark contrast between the father of his country in 63 BC and the lonely exile in 58 BC. Cicero had learned that the gratitude of the Roman state was a fleeting thing. He had saved the city, but in doing so, he had become a liability to the men who now held the real power. As he sat on the shores of the Adriatic, watching the ships head back toward the city he loved, he had to confront the possibility that his vision of a republic governed by laws was a dream that had already ended. The system was no longer looking for a protector, it was looking for a master. Exile was a period of profound psychological collapse for Cicero, a man whose entire identity was anchored to his presence in the Roman Forum and his influence within the Senate. When he crossed the Adriatic in 58 BC, he did not go as a stoic philosopher, but as a broken statesman. He spent much of his time in Thessalonica and Dyrrhachium, writing desperate letters to his friend Atticus. In these writings, we see a side of Cicero that is often omitted from the high-minded portraits of the great orator. He was prone to bouts of weeping, contemplated suicide, and expressed a deep sense of betrayal by the very institutions he had risked his life to protect. This period of isolation is a crucial part of the systemic story because it highlights the vulnerability of a political career that is built entirely on institutional prestige rather than military force. For Cicero, being away from Rome was not just a geographic separation, it was a form of civic death. One of the reasons this period was so chaotic was the lack of a clear legal framework for his exile. Clodius had passed a law that targeted Cicero specifically, but the legality of the measure was constantly being debated back in Rome. While Cicero sat in Greece, his property was being systematically dismantled. His house on the Palatine Hill was burned to the ground, and his villas in the countryside were looted. Clodius's decision to dedicate a shrine to liberty on the site of Cicero's home was a calculated move to prevent the land from ever being returned to private ownership. Under Roman law, once a piece of land was consecrated to the gods, it became sacer or sacred and could not be used for secular purposes. This was a sophisticated use of religious law as a weapon of political warfare, illustrating how every part of the Roman system was being co-opted for personal vendettas. By this point, the political situation in Rome had begun to turn against Clodius. His gang violence had become so extreme that even his former backers in the triumvirate, particularly Pompey, began to find him more of a liability than an asset. Clodius had made the mistake of targeting Pompey's own interests, which prompted the great general to support a movement for Cicero's recall. This wasn't necessarily because Pompey had a change of heart about Cicero's importance, but because he needed a counterweight to Clodius's populist influence. The street fights in Rome escalated between the gangs of Clodius and a new set of gangs led by Titus Annius Milo, a pro-Senate politician. This transition from legal debate to organized street warfare marked a permanent shift in the Republic's health. The city's governance was no longer decided by votes, but by which group could more effectively control the streets. The problem with this situation was that Cicero's recall required a massive mobilization of the Italian electorate. In August of 57 BC, the Senate finally passed a motion for his return, and the citizen assembly ratified it. Cicero's journey back to Rome was a stark contrast to his departure. He traveled through Italy as if in a triumphal procession, with towns and cities sending delegations to greet him. When he entered Rome, he was met by cheering crowds who hailed him once again as a savior. At first glance, it seemed like a total restoration of his former glory. However, the underlying reality had not changed. He had been brought back by the grace of Pompey and the triumvirate, not by the independent power of the law. He was a restored man, but he was no longer a free man. He owed his presence in the city to the very individuals who had allowed him to be exiled in the first place. One of the reasons his first few months back were so focused on his property was the symbolic importance of his house. Cicero understood that if he could not reclaim his land on the Palatine and remove the shrine of liberty, his return would be incomplete. He delivered a complex legal argument before the College of Pontiffs, the city's highest religious authority, arguing that Clodius's consecration of the site was invalid because it had been done under duress and without proper legal standing. The pontiffs eventually ruled in his favor, and the Senate voted to provide funds for the rebuilding of his house and his villas. This was a rare victory for the old legalistic order, but it was a costly one. Cicero spent the next several years in a state of constant financial anxiety, struggling to pay back the debts he had incurred during his exile and the subsequent rebuilding process. What matters here is the shift in Cicero's oratorical focus during the mid-50s BC. He found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to defend men he fundamentally despised to satisfy his political patrons. In 56 BC, he delivered the Palinode, a speech that essentially signaled his submission to the triumvirate. He defended Vatinius, a man he had previously attacked with legendary vitriol, simply because Caesar and Pompey requested it. This was a period of intellectual relaxation, in the most bitter sense. Cicero was forced to relax his principles to ensure his survival. He wrote to his friends about the shame he felt at being a prisoner of the great generals, yet he saw no other path forward. The concord of the orders was now a concord of the masters, and he was merely its most eloquent spokesperson. By this point, the triumvirate had renewed their alliance at the Conference of Lucca in 56 BC, further consolidating their grip on the state. Cicero, realizing that he could no longer influence the direction of the government, turned increasingly to his writing. This was when he produced De Orata, a masterpiece on the art of rhetoric that was also a subtle lament for the loss of genuine political discourse. He argued that the perfect orator was not just a persuasive speaker, but a philosopher-statesman who possessed a deep understanding of history, law, and ethics. By defining this ideal, Cicero was pointing out the vacuum in the current Roman leadership. The men in charge had the power, but they lacked the humanitas, the refined culture and moral grounding that Cicero believed was necessary to lead a true republic. The year 52 BC brought another systemic shock with the death of Clodius. He was killed in a random skirmish between his gang and Milo's on the Appian Way. The resulting chaos saw the Roman people burn down the Senate house to use as a funeral pyre for their fallen leader. The city descended into such violence that the Senate, in an act of desperation, appointed Pompey as sole consul, an office that was a contradiction in terms, as the consulship was by definition a shared position. Cicero was called upon to defend Milo in the trial for Clodius's murder. This should have been his greatest moment, but the atmosphere was so thick with Pompey's soldiers that Cicero, for once in his life, lost his nerve. He delivered a faltering, ineffective speech, and Milo was forced into exile. It was a clear sign that the era of the orator had been physically intimidated into silence. One of the reasons Cicero's next move was so unexpected was his appointment as the governor of Cilicia in 51 BC. A new law required a 5-year gap between holding office in Rome and holding a provincial governorship, which meant that former consuls like Cicero were drafted into service to fill the vacancies. Cicero hated the idea of leaving the center of power, but his time in Cilicia provides a unique look at his practical integrity. While most governors saw their provinces as a source of wealth, Cicero focused on reducing interest rates, settling disputes fairly, and protecting the locals from the greed of Roman tax collectors. He led a small military campaign against insurgents in the Amanus Mountains and was hailed as imperator by his troops. For a man who lived by the pen, this small taste of military success was a source of immense, perhaps slightly exaggerated, pride. The problem with his return from Cilicia in 50 BC was the timing. As he traveled back toward Italy, the relationship between Caesar and Pompey had finally reached a breaking point. The triumvirate was dead, Crassus having been killed by the Parthians years earlier. Caesar was finishing his conquest of Gaul and was demanding the right to run for the consulship in absentia to avoid being prosecuted by his enemies in the Senate. Pompey, now the champion of the traditionalist optimates, refused. Cicero found himself caught in the middle of a looming civil war. He spent the last months of 50 BC writing frantic letters to both men, begging them to find a compromise. He realized that a war between Caesar and Pompey would not result in a victory for the Republic, but merely a choice between two different types of absolute rule. One of the reasons Cicero's perspective was so bleak was his understanding of the logistics of power. He knew that Caesar's army was veteran, loyal, and highly mobile, while Pompey's forces in Italy were largely unorganized and scattered. He also knew that the Senate, while loud in its rhetoric against Caesar, lacked the physical means to resist him. Cicero's hesitation to join Pompey's camp immediately was not due to cowardice, but to a clear-eyed assessment of the situation. He saw that the rule of law had been replaced by the rule of legions. He agonized over whether to stay in Italy and try to mediate or to follow the traditionalists into Greece. This was not a choice between right and wrong, but a choice between a lost cause and an inevitable catastrophe. What matters here is how Cicero's philosophy of the mixed constitution was failing in practice. He had long argued that a stable state required a balance of monarchic, aristocratic, and democratic elements. But in 49 BC, the monarchic element had become concentrated in the hands of two rival generals. The aristocratic element, the Senate, was paralyzed by fear, and the democratic element, the people, was being used as a rhetorical tool by whoever happened to be in the forum at the time. The balance was gone. When Caesar famously crossed the Rubicon, he was not just crossing a river. He was crossing the boundary between a state governed by procedures and a state governed by the personal will of a commander. Cicero's world was shrinking to the size of a battlefield. By this point, Cicero's personal life was also in turmoil. His marriage to Terentia was failing, and his relationship with his son, Marcus, was strained. His only source of comfort was his daughter, Tullia, who shared his intellectual interests and provided him with the emotional support he lacked elsewhere. These personal struggles mirrored the disintegration of the public sphere. Just as the state was being torn apart by internal factions, Cicero's domestic life was becoming a series of legal and financial disputes. The stability that had defined his early career, the successful marriage, the rising prestige, the legal triumphs, had been replaced by a pervasive sense of insecurity and loss. He was a man watching his entire universe, both public and private, dissolve. One of the reasons Cicero eventually chose to follow Pompey to Greece in 49 BC was a sense of duty, however hopeless it felt. He felt that, as a former consul and a defender of the Senate, he could not stay in Italy and appear to support Caesar's illegal invasion. But his time in Pompey's camp was miserable. He found the other aristocrats to be arrogant, vengeful, and more interested in who would get which offices after the war than in how to actually win it. Cicero's sharp wit, which had served him so well in the Forum, became a liability in a military camp. He made constant jokes about the lack of preparation and the incompetence of the generals, which only served to alienate his allies. He was a man of the toga in a world of breastplates, and he didn't fit in either. The quiet observation that ends this part of his journey is the realization that by the end of 49 BC, Cicero had become a spectator to his own life. The decisions that mattered were being made in tents by men with swords, and the man who had once been the father of his country was now just an aging senator with a famous name and no army. He had lived to see the system he mastered become irrelevant. As the sun set on the camps in Greece, Cicero was not looking toward a victory, but toward the end of an era. The logic of the Republic had been silenced by the logic of the Civil War, and for a man of words, there was nothing left to say that anyone was willing to hear. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC was the decisive break in the logic of the Roman Civil War. For Cicero, who had been watching the conflict with a mixture of dread and biting cynicism from the sidelines of Pompey's camp, the defeat of the senatorial forces was not just a military failure, it was the final collapse of the Republican legal framework. At first glance, the war had been a struggle between two men, but the outcome signaled the end of the Senate as a sovereign body. After Pompey fled to Egypt, where he would soon be murdered, the remains of the traditionalist faction were left in a state of chaotic disintegration. Some fled to Africa to continue the fight, but Cicero chose a different path. He realized that the concord of the orders could no longer be defended through arms. He returned to Italy, landing at Brundisium, where he spent nearly a year in a state of agonizing uncertainty, waiting to see if Julius Caesar would allow him to live or if he would be treated as a traitor to the new regime. One of the reasons this period of waiting was so difficult was the complete lack of communication from Caesar, who was occupied with wars in Egypt and Asia Minor. Cicero lived in a kind of political purgatory. He could not enter Rome without Caesar's permission, yet he could not truly be at peace in the countryside, while his future remained a question of one man's whim. This situation highlights the systemic shift from a government of laws to a government of personal patronage. Cicero's safety no longer depended on his status as a former consul or his adherence to the constitution. It depended entirely on his personal relationship with the victor. During these months at Brundisium, the physical and mental strain on Cicero was visible. He grew increasingly isolated, his health suffered, and his letters from this time reflect a man who felt the weight of his own obsolescence. The problem with this situation was that Caesar's eventually granted mercy, or clementia, was a double-edged sword. When Caesar finally returned to Italy in 47 BC, he met Cicero with great respect, allowing him to return to Rome and live unmolested. But this mercy was a political tool, not a return to the old ways. By forgiving his enemies, Caesar was asserting his right to judge them. To be forgiven by a dictator is to acknowledge that the dictator has the power of life and death over you. For a man like Cicero, who had built his career on the idea that no Roman citizen should be subject to the arbitrary will of another, this was a profound humiliation. He was allowed to keep his life and his property, but he had lost his voice as a free citizen. He was now a living ornament of the Caesarian state, a reminder of the republic that Caesar had effectively replaced. By this point, the political life of Rome had moved from the forum into Caesar's private dining rooms. The Senate continued to meet, but its sessions were largely performative, rubber-stamping the decisions Caesar had already made. Cicero found himself in a state of internal exile, even while living in the heart of the city. He rarely spoke in the Senate, and when he did, his words were carefully measured to avoid offending the man who held all the cards. One of the reasons he turned so intensely to writing during the years 46 and 45 BC was that it was the only space left where he could exercise his intellect without immediate political danger. He began a massive project of translating and adapting Greek philosophy for a Roman audience, creating works like Hortensius, Academia, and De Finibus. These were not just academic exercises. They were a way of preserving the intellectual heritage of the Republic for a future that he feared would be dominated by brute force. What matters here is the emotional toll this period took on his personal life. In 46 BC, Cicero divorced Terentia after 30 years of marriage. The reasons were largely financial and logistical. He suspected her of mismanaging his estates during his absence and felt that her family was no longer a political asset. Shortly after, he married a young woman named Publilia, primarily to secure her large dowry to pay off his mounting debts. But the greatest blow came in February 45 BC, when his beloved daughter Tullia died following childbirth. For Cicero, Tullia was the one person who truly understood him. Her death shattered his remaining emotional resilience. He retreated to his villa at Astura, spending his days in near-total isolation, writing as a form of therapy. He even contemplated building a temple to her memory, a move that reflected his desperate need to find some form of permanence in a world where everything else had crumbled. One of the reasons his writing from this period, particularly the Tusculan Disputations, is so resonant is that it addresses the fundamental human problem of suffering and death within the context of a collapsing society. Cicero was trying to find a way to be a philosopher when he could no longer be a statesman. He explored the Stoic idea that virtue is sufficient for happiness, even in the face of political ruin or personal grief. This was a form of intellectual relaxation that allowed him to step back from the immediate crises of the Roman state and look at the larger constraints of the human condition. He was providing a roadmap for how to maintain one's dignity when the institutions that normally provide that dignity have disappeared. However, the political reality of Caesar's dictatorship continued to press in on him. Caesar was increasingly adopting the trappings of a king, wearing purple robes, placing his statue among the gods, and accepting lifelong tenure as dictator. For the traditionalists who remained in Rome, this was a systemic violation of the Roman soul. Cicero, while not part of the growing conspiracy against Caesar, was certainly aware of the deep-seated resentment among his peers. He maintained a complex relationship with the conspirators, particularly Brutus and Cassius. He admired their commitment to the old ideals, but doubted their ability to actually restore the Republic. He saw that the problem was not just Caesar the man, but the entire structure of power that Caesar had built. Removing the man would not necessarily remove the system. The assassination of Julius Caesar on March 15, 44 BC, happened right before Cicero's eyes. He was in the Senate House that day, though he had not been invited to join the plot. As the daggers fell, the conspirators reportedly shouted Cicero's name, calling on him to witness the restoration of liberty. At first glance, this looked like the moment Cicero had been waiting for, the sudden, violent removal of the dictator. But the immediate aftermath revealed the fundamental flaw in the conspirators' plan. They had a plan for the murder, but they had no plan for the government. They assumed that with Caesar gone, the Republic would simply restart itself like a machine. They failed to realize that Caesar's power was backed by a massive army and a populist movement that did not share the Senate's love for the old constitution. One of the reasons the situation turned so quickly against the liberators was the presence of Mark Antony. Antony, as the surviving consul and Caesar's right-hand man, took control of Caesar's papers and his vast fortune. At Caesar's funeral, he gave a speech that turned the urban masses against the conspirators, forcing Brutus and Cassius to flee the city. Cicero watched this with a growing sense of frustration. He famously wrote to a friend that the tree has been cut down, but its roots remain. He realized that Antony was simply a more thuggish version of Caesar, one who lacked Caesar's intellectual polish but possessed all of his ambition. The power vacuum left by the dictator was not being filled by the Senate. It was being fought over by the survivors of Caesar's inner circle. By this point, Cicero's voice, which had been silent for years, suddenly found its old strength. He realized that this was his last chance to intervene in the fate of the state. He began a series of 14 speeches against Mark Antony, known as the Philippics, titled in honor of Demosthenes' speeches against Philip of Macedon. These speeches were a deliberate attempt to mobilize the Senate and the people against Antony, whom Cicero painted as a drunken, violent tyrant. This was the most courageous and most dangerous period of Cicero's life. He was no longer trying to build a concord of the orders through compromise. He was declaring an all-out ideological war against the rise of a new autocracy. He was using the only weapon he had left, his eloquence, to try and stop the momentum of the military commanders. The problem with this situation was the emergence of a third player, the young Octavian. As Caesar's adopted heir, the 19-year-old Octavian arrived in Italy with no official standing, but an immense amount of social capital. He began to raise an army of Caesar's veterans who were loyal to the name of their fallen commander. Cicero saw in Octavian a potential tool to be used against Antony. He believed that the Senate could praise, decorate, and then discard the young man once Antony was defeated. This was a significant miscalculation of Octavian's character and the loyalty of the soldiers. Cicero was attempting to use old-world political manipulation on a new-world military leader. He thought he could guide the young man, treating him like a surrogate son who would listen to the wisdom of the elder statesman. What matters here is the logistics of the conflict that followed. Throughout late 44 and early 43 BC, Cicero became the de facto leader of the Senate. He coordinated the war efforts against Antony, who was besieging the city of Mutina. Cicero convinced the Senate to legitimize Octavian's private army and to send the new consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, to lead the campaign. For a brief moment, it looked as though Cicero's gamble might work. Antony was defeated and forced to retreat toward Gaul. However, both of the consuls were killed in the fighting, leaving Octavian in sole command of the victorious legions. The young man, whom Cicero thought he could discard, now held the military fate of Rome in his hands. One of the reasons the Republic finally collapsed in 43 BC was the realization by the military commanders that they had more in common with each other than with the Senate. Instead of finishing off Antony, Octavian marched his army on Rome and demanded the consulship. He then met with Antony and Lepidus to form the second triumvirate. Unlike the first alliance, this was a formal legal arrangement that gave them absolute power for 5 years. They did not need to negotiate with Cicero or the Senate. They simply had to decide how to divide the world between them. To cement their alliance, they agreed to a new round of prescriptions. Each of the 3 men was allowed to name his enemies to be executed. Antony's first choice was Cicero. The quiet conclusion of this part of Cicero's life is the collapse of his final political project. His attempt to use Octavian to save the Republic had resulted in the creation of a much more efficient and brutal dictatorship than the one Caesar had run. He had spent his final year in a feverish burst of activity, speaking, writing, and organizing, only to find that the logic of the sword had outpaced the logic of the toga once and for all. As the news of the prescriptions reached him at his villa, Cicero faced the reality that his life was the price of his final attempt to lead. He had sought to save the state through persuasion, but the state had become a place where only force was understood. The formation of the Second Triumvirate in November of 43 BC represented a fundamental break in the Roman political tradition, shifting the state from a contested republic to a military junta. Unlike the First Triumvirate, which was a private and informal agreement between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this new alliance was formalized by a law known as the Lex Titia. This legislation granted Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus absolute power for a period of 5 years, effectively suspending the constitution Cicero had spent his entire life defending. At first glance, the move seemed like a necessary measure to restore order after the chaos following Caesar's assassination, but the underlying systemic purpose was to provide a legal veneer for a purge of the political elite. The 3 men needed 2 things to secure their power: the removal of their enemies and the acquisition of massive amounts of wealth to pay their loyal legions. One of the reasons the prescriptions were revived was the sheer logistical cost of maintaining a private army in the late Republic. The triumvirs commanded nearly 45 legions between them, and these soldiers expected land and bonuses that the state treasury could not provide. By posting the names of enemies of the state in the forum, the triumvirs created a system where execution was a form of revenue generation. When a person was proscribed, their property was immediately confiscated and auctioned off to the highest bidder, often for a fraction of its true value. This created an atmosphere of terror that permeated every level of Roman society. It was not just a political purge. It was a redistribution of wealth from the traditional landed aristocracy to the new military class. Cicero, as both a vocal opponent of Antony and a man of considerable property, was an inevitable target. The problem with this situation was the deep personal animosity between Cicero and Mark Antony. During the previous year, Cicero had delivered the Philippics, a series of speeches that were not just political critiques, but savage personal attacks on Antony's character, his family, and his habits. Cicero had called him a public enemy and a monstrous beast. In the negotiations at Bononia, where the triumvirs met to divide the world, Antony insisted that Cicero must die. Octavian reportedly resisted this demand for 2 days, perhaps out of a lingering sense of gratitude for Cicero's earlier support, but eventually he conceded. This trade-off, sacrificing a mentor to secure a political alliance, is a stark illustration of the new Roman reality. Loyalty to the state and to individuals had been replaced by the cold math of power sharing. By late November, the lists began to appear in the Forum. Cicero was staying at his villa in Tusculum with his brother Quintus when the news reached them. Their initial reaction was a desperate attempt to flee to the coast and take ship for Macedonia, where the Republican forces of Brutus and Cassius were still in control. However, the logistics of their escape were poorly managed. They lacked sufficient funds and supplies for a long journey, and Quintus decided to return to his own house to gather more resources. He was captured and killed shortly thereafter. Cicero, meanwhile, reached the coast and boarded a small vessel, but the winter weather and his own failing health made the sea journey unbearable. He was a man caught between the physical limits of his body and the lethal reach of the new regime. What matters here is Cicero's mental state during these final days. He landed near Circe and spent time wandering the shore, reportedly debating whether he should head to Rome and commit suicide in the house of Octavian to bring a curse upon the young man's head. This indecision was not a sign of cowardice, but of a profound spiritual exhaustion. He had spent his life believing that the Roman system could be saved through reason and law, and he was now facing the literal and figurative death of that belief. Eventually, his slaves persuaded him to move to his villa at Formii, hoping that he would be safer there, or at least more comfortable. This villa was one of his favorite retreats, a place where he had spent many peaceful hours writing philosophy, now transformed into a temporary refuge for a fugitive. One of the reasons the end of Cicero's life feels so significant is the way he chose to face it. On December 7th, 43 BC, word arrived that the executioners were approaching the villa. His slaves, fiercely loyal to the man who had treated them with unusual kindness and intellectual respect, forced him into a litter and began to carry him through the thick woods toward the sea. However, they were betrayed by a young freedman named Philologus, whom Cicero had personally educated. The assassins, led by a centurion named Hirnius and a military tribune named Popilius Linas, whom Cicero had once defended in a murder trial, caught up with the party in the woods. When Cicero saw the soldiers approaching, he ordered his slaves to stop and put the litter down. The confrontation in the woods was brief and devoid of the dramatic flourishes one might find in a play. Cicero reportedly leaned his head out of the litter, looked his executioners directly in the eye, and told them to do their job properly. He offered his neck to the sword, an act that was viewed by later Romans as a final, stoic reclamation of his dignity. In that moment, he ceased to be a politician caught in a web of failed alliances and became a symbol of the Republic itself. By accepting his death with calm resolve, he was asserting that while the triumvirs could destroy his body, they could not touch the principles he represented. Hirnius struck the fatal blow, and then, following Antony's specific instructions, he cut off Cicero's head and the hands that had written the Philippics. The logistical handling of Cicero's remains was intended as a final act of psychological warfare against the Senate. The head and hands were carried back to Rome and presented to Mark Antony, who was presiding over a public banquet. Antony's wife, Fulvia, who had also been the target of Cicero's oratory, reportedly took the head onto her lap and pierced the tongue with her golden hairpins, a visceral expression of the resentment the elite felt toward the power of his voice. The remains were then nailed to the rostra in the Forum. This was the platform where Cicero had delivered his greatest speeches, where he had saved the city from Catiline, and where he had defended the rights of citizens against the corruption of governors. To see his decaying remains on the rostra was a signal to every Roman that the era of the toga was officially over. One of the reasons this display backfired in the long run was the reaction of the Roman people. Instead of being intimidated into silence, many were moved to a quiet, profound grief. They looked at the rostra and saw not a criminal, but the image of their own lost liberties. The Forum, which had been the heart of Roman civic life for centuries, had been turned into a macabre gallery of the proscribed. This period marked the end of the public square as a place of genuine political discourse. From this point forward, the significant decisions of the Roman world would be made in the private chambers of the palace or the tents of the generals. The logic of the crowd had been replaced by the logic of the garrison. By this point, the proscriptions had claimed the lives of over 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians. The impact on the Roman administrative class was devastating. The people who knew how to run the courts, manage the treasury, and govern the provinces were being systematically eliminated, replaced by military men whose only qualification was their loyalty to the triumvirs. This created a profound systemic instability that would take decades to resolve. Cicero's death was merely the most famous part of a broader collapse of the Roman social contract. The concord of the orders had been replaced by a state where safety was a luxury available only to those who remained silent or collaborated with the new masters. What matters here is the transition of Octavian from a member of the triumvirate to the future Emperor Augustus. While he had participated in the proscriptions, he eventually realized that he could not rule a stable empire through terror alone. As he consolidated his power and eventually defeated Antony and Lepidus, he began to integrate the memory of the Republic into his new imperial narrative. He did not want to be seen as a successor to the blood-soaked triumvirs, but as the restorer of the Republic. This required a rehabilitation of men like Cicero. The fact that Octavian eventually allowed Cicero's son to serve as consul was a calculated piece of political theater, intended to show that the new regime was inclusive and had moved past the violence of its founding. One of the reasons Cicero's works survived this period of intense censorship and violence is the specific nature of Roman elite culture. Even the men who supported the triumvirs respected Cicero's mastery of the Latin language. To destroy his books would have been seen as an act of cultural vandalism that even a dictator might hesitate to commit. His freedman Tiro and his friend Atticus worked quietly in the background to preserve his correspondence and his philosophical treatises, recognizing that, while the man was gone, his intellectual legacy was a commodity of immense value. They ensured that his voice would continue to be heard in the schools of rhetoric and the libraries of the wealthy, even if it was no longer allowed in the Senate. The quiet observation that can be made here is that Cicero's death provided him with a lasting influence that he might have lost had he lived into a diminished old age under the empire. By dying as a martyr for the Republic, he became a standard of virtue and eloquence for all future generations. His life became a textbook for the gentleman statesman, a model of how to combine a life of action with a life of the mind. The constraints of his time, the professionalization of the army, the rise of populist demagogues, and the breakdown of institutional trust are issues that continue to resonate in the study of history. He was a man who tried to solve modern problems with ancient tools, and while he failed to save his state, he succeeded in defining the terms of the debate for the next 2,000 years. The problem with focusing only on the violence of his end is that it can obscure the sincere, grounded nature of his life's work. Cicero was not a revolutionary, he was a preservationist. He believed that the Roman Republic was the most perfect form of government ever devised, and his tragedy was that he lived to see its internal contradictions tear it apart. He was the last great voice of an era that valued the power of the word over the power of the sword, and his silence marked the beginning of a long, quiet period of imperial rule. The Roman world was moving into a new phase of its existence, one that would bring more stability but less freedom, and Cicero's head on the rostra was the final, grim punctuation mark at the end of the Republican chapter. One of the reasons this narration feels complete for tonight is that we have reached the end of the man, though not the end of his influence. The city of Rome was still there, the Senate still met, and the legions still marched, but the soul of the state had fundamentally changed. As the lights go out on the Forum of 43 BC, we are left with the image of a man who, for all his vanity and his indecision, never stopped believing in the possibility of a government based on law. It is a quiet, intellectual relaxation to consider that even in the face of absolute power, a single voice can leave a mark that outlasts the empires that try to silence it. With the death of Cicero, the intellectual and moral center of the Roman senatorial class had been physically removed, leaving a void that the Second Triumvirate filled with administrative efficiency and military rigor. At first glance, the state seemed to continue its traditional functions, but the systemic reality was that the Republic had transitioned into a period of total mobilization for the final confrontation between the remaining factions of the Civil War. The triumvirs, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, were no longer competing within a legal framework. They were competing for the absolute control of the Mediterranean's resources. The proscriptions had served their immediate purpose of decapitating the opposition and funding the legions, but they had also created a culture of deep-seated suspicion. In this new Rome, safety was found in anonymity or absolute loyalty to a single commander, a far cry from the vibrant, if chaotic, public life that Cicero had championed. One of the reasons the period following 43 BC felt so different was the shift in how information and influence flowed through the city. Under Cicero's Republic, power was brokered in public speeches and semi-private gatherings in the houses of the elite, where persuasion was the primary currency. In the triumviral era, power became centralized in the military headquarters of the three leaders. The Senate, once the deliberative heart of the state, was now largely a body of survivors and sycophants who understood that their primary role was to legitimize the edicts of the triumvirs. This transition is often misunderstood as a simple act of tyranny, but it was actually a logistical response to the failure of the old institutions to manage the vast complexities of an empire. The triumvirs provided a centralized decision-making structure that the fractured Senate simply could not match. The problem with this situation was that while the triumvirs were united in their desire to eliminate the liberators, Brutus and Cassius, they were deeply divided by their own competing ambitions. The year 42 BC saw the focus of the Roman world shift from the streets of the capital to the plains of Philippi in Macedonia. Brutus and Cassius had managed to assemble a massive force, drawing on the resources of the eastern provinces and the loyalty of those who still believed in the Republican cause. This was the final military stand of the old order. What matters here is the logistical scale of the conflict. Nearly 200,000 soldiers were involved in the two battles at Philippi, representing a level of militarization that the Roman economy could barely sustain. The defeat of the Republican forces and the subsequent suicides of Brutus and Cassius marked the end of any viable military opposition to the new regime. By this point, the world was effectively divided between Octavian in the west and Mark Antony in the east, with Lepidus being gradually sidelined. This division created two distinct styles of governance that reflected the personalities and strategic needs of the two remaining masters. Octavian, remaining in Italy, faced the difficult task of settling tens of thousands of veterans on land confiscated from Italian towns. This process was brutal and unpopular, leading to the Perusine War, a brief but sharp conflict that pitted Octavian against Antony's brother and wife. One of the reasons Octavian's position was so precarious was that he lacked the military prestige of Antony. He had to rely on his administrative ruthlessness and his association with the deified Julius Caesar to maintain his grip on a restless and hungry Italy. In the East, Mark Antony was creating a very different kind of power structure. He moved through Greece and Asia Minor not just as a Roman general, but as a Hellenistic monarch, blending Roman authority with the religious and cultural traditions of the East. It was during this time that he solidified his relationship with Cleopatra Roman VII of Egypt. From a systemic perspective, the alliance with Egypt was a masterstroke of logistics. Egypt was the wealthiest and most productive region in the Mediterranean, capable of providing the vast amounts of grain and gold needed to sustain Antony's ambitions. However, this alliance also provided Octavian with the perfect rhetorical weapon. He began to frame the coming conflict not as another civil war between Romans, but as a patriotic crusade against an Oriental queen who had supposedly bewitched a Roman hero. What matters here is the quiet, steady way Octavian began to rehabilitate the idea of the state in the West, while Antony was becoming increasingly associated with foreign royalty. Octavian realized that to rule long-term, he could not simply be a warlord. He had to be seen as the restorer of traditional Roman values. He began to repair temples, enforce social legislation, and cultivate a circle of poets and thinkers, most notably Virgil and Horace, who could create a new cultural narrative for Rome. This was a sophisticated form of intellectual relaxation for the public, offering a sense of stability and historical continuity after decades of violence. Octavian was essentially building a bridge between the old Republic of Cicero and the new empire he intended to create. The problem with the triumviral system was its inherent instability. The rule of three was never intended to be permanent. It was a temporary bridge to an inevitable rule of one. By 36 BC, Octavian had successfully removed Lepidus from power and defeated the last of the Pompeian resistance at sea. The stage was now set for the final confrontation with Antony. One of the reasons this lead-up to war was so drawn out was the need for both sides to build their legal and moral cases. Octavian used Antony's donations of Alexandria, where Antony granted Roman territories to his and Cleopatra's children, as proof that Antony had abandoned his Roman identity. This was a brilliant piece of political logistics, turning the conflict into a matter of national survival rather than a personal rivalry. Looking at the lead-up to the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, we see a Roman world that was exhausted by the constant cycle of mobilization and conflict. The citizen soldiers of the early Republic had been replaced by professional legions who were more interested in their pay and their retirement land than in the fine points of constitutional law. The system had become so centralized that the entire Mediterranean world was now waiting for the outcome of a single naval encounter off the coast of Greece. Actium was not a particularly bloody or complex battle, but its symbolic weight was immense. When Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt, the Roman world realized that the era of the civil wars was finally ending. Octavian was left as the sole master of the Roman state. By this point, the question facing Octavian was how to transform a military dictatorship into a stable, long-term government. He could not simply call himself a king, as that would have invited the same fate as Julius Caesar. Instead, he embarked on a series of carefully staged constitutional maneuvers. In 27 BC, in a ceremony that was a masterpiece of political theater, he restored the Republic to the Senate and the people. In return, the Senate granted him the title Augustus, a word that carried connotations of religious awe and ancient prestige, and gave him a set of powers that allowed him to control the army and the provinces without holding a traditional office. He became the princeps, or first citizen. This was the birth of the Principate, a system that maintained the outward appearance of Cicero's republic while concentrating all real power in the hands of one man. One of the reasons the Augustan system worked so well for so long was its focus on administrative competence. Augustus realized that the chaos of the late Republic had been caused, in part, by the lack of a professional bureaucracy. He created a civil service, often staffed by equestrians and freedmen, to manage the grain supply, the fire brigade, the city's water, and the tax collection of the provinces. This reduced the incentives for the kind of predatory corruption that Cicero had prosecuted in the trial of Verres. By making the empire run more smoothly and predictably, Augustus removed the systemic pressures that had fueled the rise of populist demagogues. The rule of law was replaced by the rule of administration, providing a different kind of safety for the Roman citizen. It is helpful to consider the fate of the Roman elite under this new regime. The old families, the ones Cicero had alternately praised and scolded, had to adapt to a world where their political influence was filtered through the emperor's court. Some resisted and were destroyed, but many others found a new kind of prestige as imperial administrators, generals, and diplomats. They traded their independent political power for security and a place in the new social hierarchy. The Senate continued to meet and debate, but the stakes were lower. The intense, life-and-death oratory of Cicero's day was replaced by the polished, somewhat hollow speeches of the imperial era. The Forum was no longer a battlefield. It was a monument to the peace that Augustus had brought. One of the reasons the memory of Cicero remained so potent during this period was its usefulness as a cultural anchor. Augustus understood that his regime needed a sense of historical legitimacy. By allowing the study of Cicero's Latin and his philosophical works, Augustus was signaling that the new empire was the legitimate heir to the Republic's intellectual achievements. Cicero became the father of the language, even as the political world he represented was being dismantled. This paradox allowed the Roman elite to maintain a sense of pride in their past while accepting the reality of their present. They could read Cicero's defenses of liberty in the morning and attend the emperor's levee in the afternoon without feeling a sense of contradiction. The quiet observation that ends this transition is the realization of how much had been lost in the pursuit of stability. The concord of the orders that Cicero had dreamed of was finally achieved, but it was a concord of silence and obedience rather than active participation. The Republic had been a high-friction system, full of noise, conflict, and the constant risk of collapse, but it had also been a place of immense human energy and political creativity. The empire was a low-friction system, smooth, efficient, and durable, but it lacked the vital, messy heart of the old state. Cicero's death was the necessary price for this transition, a final sacrifice to the gods of order. As the Roman world settled into the long period of the Pax Romana, the figure of Cicero transitioned from a man into a monument. He was the reference point for everything that came before the emperors, a reminder of a time when a single voice could challenge the most powerful men in the world. While the system he loved was gone, the intellectual tools he created to understand and describe that system remained, waiting for a future age that might once again value the power of the word over the power of the sword. The story of Cicero is the story of the end of a certain kind of human possibility in the ancient world, and the beginning of a long, stable, and much quieter chapter of history. The transition of Cicero from a living political figure into an educational institution is one of the more remarkable aspects of Roman history. By the middle of the 1st century AD, less than 100 years after his death, Cicero had become the undisputed primary model for Latin prose. This was not merely a matter of literary taste. It was a systemic necessity of the imperial administration. As the Roman Empire expanded, it required a vast number of bureaucrats, lawyers, and governors who could communicate clearly and persuasively across diverse provinces. The Ciceronian style, characterized by balanced periods, logical clarity, and a specific rhythmic cadence, provided a standardized linguistic framework for the entire Mediterranean world. In the schools of rhetoric that flourished under the emperors, young men were no longer taught how to debate the fate of the Republic, but they were taught to write and speak exactly like the man who had died trying to save it. One of the reasons this educational focus was so successful was the sheer volume of material Cicero had left behind. Because his secretary, Tiro, and his friend Atticus had carefully preserved his works, the Roman educational system had access to a complete curriculum in a single author. A student could study the Philippics to learn the art of the attack, the Proarchia to learn the defense of culture, and the letters to Atticus to see the mechanics of a professional life. This availability meant that Cicero's personality, his vocabulary, and even his specific mannerisms became embedded in the mental architecture of the Roman elite. To be educated in the Roman Empire was, essentially, to be immersed in the mind of Marcus Tullius Cicero. This created a paradoxical situation where the very people serving the emperors were trained in the language of a man who viewed absolute power as a moral and political disaster. What matters here is the way the Roman authorities managed this paradox. The emperors, starting with Augustus and continuing through the Julio-Claudians, realized that they could not suppress Cicero's influence without appearing like uncultured tyrants. Instead, they neutralized his political bite by framing him as a purely literary and ethical figure. In the schools, teachers focused on the structure of his sentences and the decorum of his behavior rather than the specific republican ideals he had advocated. Cicero was presented as a lover of his country, whose main contribution was the refinement of the Latin tongue. This intellectual relaxation allowed the state to benefit from his educational value while ignoring his revolutionary potential. He became a safe classic, a monument that everyone respected but few people used as a guide for actual political resistance. The problem with this situation was that it led to a certain hollowed-out quality in Roman oratory. In the Republic, a speech in the Forum could change the course of history, lead to the exile of a corrupt governor, or prevent a civil war. In the Empire, oratory became a performance art, practiced in the controversi and suasorii, imaginary legal cases used as school exercises. Students would debate whether a hero should be rewarded or whether a hypothetical tyrant should be killed, using all of Cicero's rhetorical tricks, but none of his real-world risk. This shift from practical governance to academic exercise changed the nature of the Latin language itself, making it more ornate and self-conscious. While the style remained Ciceronian, the substance was increasingly detached from the actual decision-making processes of the imperial court. One of the reasons Cicero's philosophical works survived so well during this period was their utility to the emerging class of professional administrators. Works like De Officiis on Duties provided a secular moral code that was perfectly suited to the needs of the imperial service. It taught that a man's highest duty was to be useful to his community, to act with justice, and to maintain his dignity. For a Roman governor in Gaul or a tax collector in Syria, these writings provided a sense of professional ethics that was not dependent on the shifting whims of the emperor in Rome. Cicero had translated Greek Stoicism and academic skepticism into a practical Roman idiom, creating a philosophy of the toga that helped hold the empire together long after the political freedom of the capital had vanished. By this point, we should consider the role of Quintilian, the most famous teacher of rhetoric in the 1st century AD. In his massive work, Institutio Oratoria, Quintilian codified the worship of Cicero. He famously stated that to have a great love for Cicero is already a sign of progress. Quintilian viewed Cicero not just as a great speaker, but as the perfect orator, the ideal man who combined supreme eloquence with a virtuous life. By setting Cicero up as an unattainable standard, Quintilian helped to stabilize the Latin language and the Roman educational system for centuries. He ensured that even as the empire faced political crises and military threats, its cultural elite would share a common linguistic and ethical heritage. This was a form of cultural logistics that provided a sense of continuity in an ever-changing world. At first glance, it might seem that Cicero's influence was limited to the pagan elite, but one of the most interesting aspects of his legacy is how he was received by the early Christians. As the new religion began to spread among the educated classes of the Roman Empire, it faced a dilemma: how to reconcile the beauty of classical Latin with the simplicity of the Gospels. Many of the early church fathers, such as Jerome and Augustine, were deeply trained in the Ciceronian tradition. Jerome famously recounted a dream in which he was brought before the judgment seat of God and accused of being a Ciceronian, not a Christian. Despite this anxiety, these thinkers could not escape their education. They used Cicero's logical structures and rhetorical techniques to explain and defend Christian doctrine. In doing so, they ensured that the language of the Republic would become the language of the Church. The logic of this transition is quite simple. To reach an educated audience in the Roman world, one had to speak the language of Cicero. This meant that the intellectual tools developed to defend the Roman Senate were eventually used to build the foundations of Christian theology. When Augustine wrote The City of God, He was engaging in a direct dialogue with Cicero's on the Republic. He used Cicero's definitions of justice and the state to argue that the true republic was not found on earth, but in the kingdom of heaven. This was a massive act of systemic reframing. Cicero's secular ideals were baptized and integrated into a new religious framework, ensuring their survival through the collapse of the Roman Empire and into the Middle Ages. One of the reasons this narration remains calm and focused is that we are looking at the long-term patterns of human thought rather than the sudden peaks of individual drama. Cicero's life ended in violence, but his afterlife was a slow, steady expansion of influence through the quiet work of copyists and teachers. In the monasteries of the early Middle Ages, while the physical infrastructure of Rome was falling into ruin, monks were painstakingly copying Cicero's manuscripts. They did this not because they were republicans, but because they recognized that his Latin was the key to understanding the law, the philosophy, and the administration of the past. He was the bridge across the Dark Ages, a repository of civilized thought that remained available whenever a society was ready to rebuild. What matters here is the concept of humanitas. Cicero was the one who popularized this term to describe the qualities that make a person truly civilized, a combination of education, empathy, and social responsibility. This idea became the core of the Western educational tradition. It suggested that a person was not born fully human, but became so through the study of literature, history, and philosophy. By placing this ideal at the center of his work, Cicero created a goal for education that transcended the specific political needs of the Roman state. Even when there was no Senate to serve, there was still a human soul to cultivate. This is one of the primary reasons his works were never discarded. They addressed a fundamental need for self-improvement and social order that survived the fall of empires. By this point, the Roman Empire was moving toward its own period of systemic stress in the 3rd and 4th centuries. As the borders became more porous and the central government became more militarized, the Ciceronian tradition served as a kind of cultural fortification. For the provincial elites, maintaining a high standard of Ciceronian Latin was a way of asserting their Roman identity in the face of a changing world. It was a sign that they still belonged to the great tradition of the past, even as the present became increasingly chaotic. The intellectual relaxation provided by reading Cicero's dialogues allowed these men to feel part of a stable, rational universe, even when the reality outside their villas was anything but. The problem with this situation was that, as the Western Empire finally collapsed in the 5th century, the physical books became increasingly rare. Many of Cicero's works were lost or hidden in obscure libraries. However, his reputation was so large that even the fragment of his thought that remained was enough to influence the development of the new European kingdoms. The medieval liberal arts, the trivium and quadrivium, were built on the rhetorical and logical foundations that Cicero had championed. He remained the authority on how to speak and write, a ghost who haunted the corridors of every cathedral, school, and university. He was the master of those who speak, as Dante would later imply, a guide to the possibilities of human reason. One of the reasons we look at Cicero in this way is to understand how a single life can become a systemic component of a civilization. He was not just a politician, he was a catalyst for a specific way of thinking about the world. He believed that the power of the mind and the power of the law were the only legitimate bases for society. While he failed to realize this ideal in his own lifetime, he succeeded in planting it so deeply in the soil of Western culture that it would eventually grow back in new and unexpected forms. The concord of the orders became the balance of powers, and the father of his country became a model for the modern citizen. The quiet observation that ends this part of the story is that Cicero's true consulship began after his death. He governed the minds of the Western world for nearly 2,000 years, providing the language of justice, the framework of law, and the ideals of education. As we move into the final chapters of his influence, we see a man who had been silenced by a sword, but who eventually spoke louder than all the emperors combined. The steady, intelligent person explaining history out loud is, in many ways, an heir to the Ciceronian tradition of sharing knowledge for the good of the community. The transition from the medieval period into the Renaissance represents one of the most significant systemic re-entries of a historical figure into the active political and social life of a civilization. For centuries, Cicero had been respected as a master of style and a source of ethical maxims, but he was viewed primarily through a fragmented lens. Many of his most personal and politically raw works had been tucked away in monastic libraries, largely unread or understood only as abstract exercises in Latinity. This changed in 1345, when the Italian scholar and poet Petrarch discovered a collection of Cicero's personal letters to his friend Atticus in the Cathedral Library of Verona. This was not just a literary discovery, it was a psychological shock to the European intellectual system. For the first time, a medieval scholar encountered the real Cicero, not the marble statue of the schoolrooms, but a man who was anxious, vain, deeply involved in the messy logistics of power, and profoundly human. One of the reasons this discovery was so transformative was that it offered a new model for the active life. Medieval scholarship had long emphasized the contemplative life, often focused on the withdrawal from the world into religious study. Cicero's letters, however, described a man who believed that the highest form of human existence was found in the service of the state and the management of public affairs. Petrarch and the generations of humanists who followed him began to see Cicero not as a distant authority, but as a contemporary peer who had faced the same problems of political corruption, systemic collapse, and personal integrity. This Ciceronianism became the foundational ideology of the Renaissance, providing the intellectual tools for the rise of the Italian city-states and the eventual development of modern civic life. The problem with this situation, at least initially, was the internal conflict it created within the scholars themselves. Petrarch, after reading the letters, famously wrote a letter back across time to Cicero, scolding him for getting so involved in the dirty world of politics and for his restless and distressed life. He couldn't understand why a man of such immense philosophical talent would waste his energy trying to save a dying republic. But as the Renaissance progressed, this view shifted. Scholars like Leonardo Bruni in Florence began to argue that Cicero's greatness was inseparable from his political involvement. They realized that his philosophy was not a distraction from his politics, but the very engine that drove it. This led to the birth of civic humanism, the idea that education and eloquence were meant to be used for the benefit of the community, a direct echo of Cicero's own Concord of the Orders. What matters here is the way Cicero's works provided a blueprint for the reorganization of the European educational system. The Studia Humanitatis, which included grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy, was essentially a Ciceronian curriculum. One of the reasons this worked so well was the introduction of the printing press, in the mid-15th century. Cicero's De Officiis was the first classical work ever printed, and it quickly became one of the most widely owned books in Europe, second only to the Bible. This mass distribution meant that the rule of law and the duty of the citizen were no longer the exclusive property of a few scholars. They were becoming the common language of the rising European middle class and the administrators of the new nation-states. By this point, the political logistics of Europe were shifting away from feudalism and toward more centralized forms of government. The rulers of these new states needed a class of educated men who could draft laws, negotiate treaties, and manage complex financial systems. Cicero's writings provided the perfect training manual for this new bureaucracy. His emphasis on clarity, persuasion, and the common good allowed these men to frame their work not just as service to a king, but as service to the state itself. This was a subtle but profound systemic shift. It introduced the idea of the public servant, a role that was defined by professional ethics and legal procedures rather than just personal fealty to a lord. Cicero had become the patron saint of the modern administrator. One of the reasons Cicero's influence was so durable during the Enlightenment was his focus on natural law. In works like De Legibus on the Laws, Cicero argued that true law was not just whatever a ruler decided, but was based on the right reason inherent in nature and accessible to all human beings. This idea was incredibly powerful for thinkers like John Locke, Montesquieu, and the founders of the American Republic. They used Cicero's arguments to challenge the divine right of kings and to argue for a government of laws, not of men. When Thomas Jefferson spoke of the laws of nature and of nature's God in the Declaration of Independence, he was using a vocabulary that had been refined by Cicero 2,000 years earlier. The Roman orator had provided the intellectual scaffolding for the modern democratic state. The problem with the Ciceronian model in the 18th century was the tension between the ideal of the republic and the reality of the emerging industrial world. Just as Cicero had struggled with the mismatch between the old city-state constitution and a global empire, the Enlightenment thinkers were struggling with the mismatch between ancient ideals of virtue and the new reality of commercial society. However, they found in Cicero a way to bridge this gap. He had shown that a man could be both a philosopher and a practical man of business, both an idealist and a realist. This intellectual relaxation allowed the founders of the modern world to pursue economic progress without entirely abandoning the concept of civic duty. They saw in Cicero a gentleman who navigated a changing world with his dignity intact. At first glance, it might seem strange that a man from the 1st century BC would be so relevant to the 1700s, but the systemic constraints were surprisingly similar. Both eras were dealing with the breakdown of old social orders and the need to create new, more inclusive political structures. Cicero's belief in a mixed constitution, a balance of power between different branches of government, became the direct inspiration for the American system of checks and balances. The idea that no one person or group should have absolute power was a Ciceronian lesson learned from the failures of the Roman Republic. When the American founders chose the motto E pluribus unum, out of many, one, they were attempting to achieve the very concord of the orders that had eluded Cicero. One of the reasons this narration remains focused on systems rather than heroes is to highlight how ideas function as technology. Cicero's rhetorical and legal techniques were a type of social technology that allowed large groups of people to coordinate their actions without constant violence. In the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, these techniques were rediscovered and updated for a new age. The art of persuasion became the art of politics. The rule of law became the constitution. This transition shows that while individuals like Cicero pass away, the systemic solutions they develop can become permanent parts of the human toolkit. We are still using the tools Cicero built, even if we are building different kinds of structures with them. What matters here is the concept of decorum, which Cicero discussed at length in his ethical works. Decorum was the idea that a person's actions should be appropriate to their status, their abilities, and the specific situation they were in. In the 18th century, this became the basis for the modern concept of professionalism. It suggested that a public official or a lawyer had a duty to act with a certain level of restraint and dignity, regardless of their personal feelings. This was a crucial development for the stability of modern institutions. It provided a set of soft rules that complemented the hard rules of the law, creating a social environment where disagreement did not necessarily lead to conflict. It was the concord of civil society. By this point, the educational worship of Cicero began to face its first real challenge from the Romantic movement in the early 19th century. Thinkers like Thomas Carlyle began to favor heroes and men of action over the wordy and vain Cicero. They preferred the decisive military force of a Julius Caesar to the balanced periods and legal compromises of an orator. This shift in the cultural mood mirrored the political reality of the time, as Europe once again moved toward an era of great men and revolutionary violence. Cicero was criticized for his indecision and his inability to stop the collapse of the Republic. This critique is often misunderstood as a judgment on his character, but it was actually a reflection of the Romantics' own frustration with the complexities of democratic politics. The logic of this critique is simple. In a time of crisis, people often lose patience with the slow, messy processes of law and debate. They want a savior who can cut the Gordian knot with a sword. Cicero, by his very nature, represented the knot, not the sword. He represented the idea that the process is more important than the outcome. For the Romantics, this felt like weakness. But for those who had lived through the horrors of absolute power, whether in the Roman Empire or the Napoleonic Wars, Cicero's weakness was seen as his greatest strength. It was the refusal to simplify the world at the expense of justice. He remained the primary advocate for the difficult, often frustrating work of maintaining a free society. One of the reasons this historical perspective is so calming is the realization that these debates are never truly finished. The struggle between the orator and the general, between the law and the sword, is a permanent feature of human history. Cicero's life and death provide a clear, well-documented map of one side of that struggle. By studying his influence on the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, we can see how his ideas provided a sense of orientation for people who were trying to build a more rational and just world. He was the voice in the head of the people who designed the institutions we still live in today. He provided the vocabulary for the modern soul. The quiet observation that ends this part of the story is that Cicero's true triumph was not the one he celebrated in Rome, but the one he enjoyed in the libraries and legislatures of the modern world. He became a ghost who could not be exorcised from the Western mind. As long as there are people who believe that laws should be debated in public, that power should be balanced, and that education is the foundation of citizenship, Cicero will remain a contemporary. He is the steady, intelligent person explaining why things happen the way they did, not just for his own time, but for every time that values the light of reason over the darkness of force. The 19th and 20th centuries brought a significant reevaluation of Cicero, shifting him from a semi-sacred figure of the Enlightenment into a subject of rigorous modern historical analysis. As the field of history became a professionalized academic discipline, scholars began to look past the perfect orator to find the systemic reality of the man's life. One of the reasons this period was so challenging for Cicero's reputation was the rise of German historiography, particularly through the work of Theodor Mommsen. Mommsen, writing in the mid-1800s, viewed the collapse of the Roman Republic through the lens of national unity and strong leadership. In his eyes, Julius Caesar was the visionary hero who unified the state, while Cicero was a short-sighted and vain politician who obstructed the inevitable march of progress. This critique was a reflection of the 19th century fascination with great men of action, but it failed to account for the systemic commitment to legalism that defined Cicero's entire career. One of the reasons Mommsen's view was so influential was that it coincided with a period of massive political consolidation across Europe. As new empires were being built, the messy, deliberative politics of the Roman Senate felt like a relic of a less efficient past. However, the problem with this situation was that it ignored the long-term consequences of replacing a constitutional republic with a military autocracy. It took the catastrophes of the 20th century, specifically the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 1930s and 40s, to bring Cicero back into favor as a vital defender of human rights and institutional integrity. Scholars like Hannah Arendt and others began to look at Cicero not as an obstacle to progress, but as a crucial advocate for the public space, the idea that politics is something that happens between equal citizens through speech, rather than something imposed from above through force. What matters here is how Cicero's concept of natural law provided a foundation for the development of modern international law and human rights after World War II. When the world was looking for a way to judge the crimes of regimes that had operated legally within their own borders, they returned to the Ciceronian idea that there is a higher law, based on reason and human dignity, that transcends the statutes of any single state. This wasn't just poetic sentiment, it was a practical, systemic tool used in the Nuremberg trials and the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Cicero had provided the vocabulary for holding power accountable to justice, a need that became tragically clear in the middle of the 20th century. The orator's struggle against the prescriptions of the triumvirs was seen as a precursor to the struggle against the ideological purges of the modern era. By this point, the educational role of Cicero had also evolved. While he was no longer the sole model for Latin prose in an age of diverse literary styles, he remained a central figure in the study of law and political theory. One of the reasons his work continues to be taught is its focus on the logistics of persuasion. In a world increasingly dominated by mass communication and digital media, Cicero's analysis of how to structure an argument, how to read an audience, and how to use language to build consensus is as relevant as ever. He remains the primary theorist of the middle way, the idea that a stable society is built on compromise and the inclusion of different social orders. His Concord of the Orders is now understood as a precursor to the modern pluralistic society. The problem with our current situation is that we often face the same systemic pressures that Cicero did. The the professionalization of the military, the rise of populist demagoguery, and the breakdown of institutional trust. When we read his letters to Atticus, we see a man struggling with the realization that the rules of the game are changing and that the old safety nets of the law are being cut away. This makes his work feel incredibly contemporary. He provides a mental check for anyone living through a period of systemic transition. He asks us to consider what happens to a civilization when it trades its freedom for the promise of order, and what is lost when the power of the word is replaced by the power of the algorithm or the image. He is the voice of caution in an age of move fast and break things. One of the reasons this narration is concluding now is that we have followed the thread of Cicero's influence from the hills of Arpinum to the halls of modern legislatures. We have seen how a man with no army and no royal blood could leave a mark on the human mind that has lasted for over 2,000 years. The systemic reframe we began with, viewing Cicero as a statesman attempting to maintain a legalistic framework in an era of military dominance, has allowed us to see his life not as a personal failure, but as a profound exploration of the limits of human reason in the face of absolute power. He was a man who understood that a republic is not just a set of laws, but a habit of the mind, a collective commitment to solving problems through talk rather than violence. What matters here is the quiet, persistent nature of his legacy. Cicero did not leave behind great monuments of stone or a vast empire of territory. He left behind a library of ideas. He showed that the most durable thing a human being can create is a well-reasoned argument for justice. While his head and hands were nailed to the rostra, his words escaped the forum and traveled across the centuries, providing a guide for every generation that has had to rebuild its own sense of order from the ruins of conflict. He is the ultimate new man, the provincial outsider who through sheer intellectual effort became the teacher of the Western world. His life is a reminder that the work of maintaining a civilization is never finished. It requires a constant, daily commitment to the values of humanitas. Looking back on our journey through the ages with Cicero, we can see the logic of his life as a series of attempts to widen the perspective of his fellow citizens. He tried to bridge the gap between Greek philosophy and Roman practice, between the interests of the elite and the needs of the common people, and between the history of the past and the possibilities of the future. While he often fell short of his own high ideals, the fact that he articulated them so clearly gave the world a target to aim for. He made the rule of law an aspirational goal for humanity. In the quiet of our modern night, his voice still serves as a sincere, grounded explanation of why things happened the way they did and how we might choose a different path. One of the reasons this historical study is so soothing is the realization that we are not the first to face these questions. The anxieties we feel about the future of our institutions were felt just as keenly by a man walking the shores of Formii 20 centuries ago. There is a sense of orientation in knowing that the struggle for a just society is a permanent part of the human condition. Cicero's life provides us with a map of the territory, showing us where the pitfalls are and where the high ground can be found. He allows us to approach our own challenges with a bit of intellectual relaxation, knowing that the tools of reason and persuasion are still available to us if we have the courage and the patience to use them. The quiet observation that ends this story is that Cicero's Concord of the Orders was never a destination, but a process. It was the ongoing work of keeping people talking to each other instead of fighting each other. By the time he offered his neck to the sword, he had already done the work of 100 lifetimes. He had defined the language of law, the ethics of public service, and the goals of education. He had lived a life of action and a life of the mind, proving that the two are inseparable. As the Roman world moved into the long silence of the empire, Cicero's books remained, waiting like seeds in the soil for the next spring of human liberty. By this point, we have seen how the machinery of the Roman world was disassembled and reassembled into something new. We have watched the master of Latin eloquence navigate the collapse of his world with his wit and his dignity intact. We have explored the causes, constraints, and incentives that drove his decisions and shaped his legacy. The narration has done its simple thing. It has calmly explained why things happened the way they did. The listener, hopefully now oriented and unconcerned about missing something crucial, can find safety in the knowledge that the past is a well-documented country and that men like Cicero have already walked the path we are on. One of the reasons this concludes here is that there is a certain symmetry in ending where his influence became permanent. He is no longer a man, he is a tradition. He is the steady, intelligent person explaining history out loud, a role he has played for every generation that has opened his books. The Roman Republic is long gone, but the Republic of Letters that Cicero helped to build is still standing, a space where ideas are debated, laws are analyzed, and the human spirit is cultivated through the study of our shared history. He belongs to us now, as much as he belonged to the Romans of 43 BC. The final note of this history is one of dry clarity. Marcus Tullius Cicero was a man of immense talent and significant flaws, caught in a systemic crisis that was larger than any one individual. He used his voice to defend a vision of the state that eventually failed, but in the process, he created a vision of the human being that has endured. He taught us that to be truly human is to be a citizen, to care about the law, to seek justice, and to value the power of the mind over the power of the sword. This is the simple, sincere lesson that he left for the ages.